claim that the police had tunnel vision and that they went directly after Darlie, and that's the only place that they focused. That they stayed after Darlie, period. No other person. But then they'll come back and say, well, Glenn Mize was eliminated as a suspect. Rich, you said that. I don't think he was ever a police suspect. I think he was a supporter suspect. Maybe in one of your videos, Rich, you can explain how Glenn Mize was eliminated as a suspect by law. But anyways, this is the affidavit of Doug Parks, which is one of Darlie's first court-appointed attorneys. You can see him here. It's a very well-known clip where Darlie walks into the courtroom and sits down next to Doug Parks. You can also see him in the last defense. Now I'm going to break this down, fairly quickly. First, they tell who they are, and they state that they're fully competent to make it. They're not being promised anything. Blah, blah, blah. And this is a bunch of blah, 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 yada, yada, yada. State bar, address of his law firm. On June 28, 1996, I was appointed counsel for defendant Darlie Lynn Routier in this case of Texas v. Routier number F9639973J and A96253 Kerr County, in which Ms. Routier was alleged to have caused the death of her son, Damon Routier. I continued to serve in that capacity until the substitution of counsel on October 21, 1996. That's when they thought that they would get her a better attorney outside of a public defender. The family had raised some money. And, according to Darlie Key, that the kids gave up their college funds before people, mortgaged their homes and all this stuff to get this money for Douglas Mulder. Doug Mulder is very expensive. He was known as Mad Dog Mulder. He's a really good attorney. He worked directly under Henry Wade, which I'm not going to hold that against him. But Henry Wade, if he wanted you convicted, you got convicted, period. Henry Wade also, during the Lee Harvey Oswald interrogations, there was a big thing about people not taking notes. Like Captain Fritz, they had Lee Harvey Oswald up on the third floor, and they had him right in Captain Fritz's office with all these people asking him questions, and they claimed not to take notes, but later we found out that Captain Fritz did take notes. On June 28, 1996. Okay. It's my professional opinion, and was at the time that I represented Miss Routier, that a zealous defense of Miss Routier necessarily involves the implicating of her husband, Darin Eugene Routier, in the death of Damon. At the time I represented Miss Routier, I fully intended to introduce evidence that would implicate Darin Routier at trial, such as, for example, a pair of Mr. Routier's undergarments stained with blood on the elastic waistband. So, Darin was a suspect. Even the attorneys, even Doug Mulder thought he had something to do with it. And I'll tell you this, if they would have presented Darin as a suspect in court, that would have created enough reasonable doubt for Darlie to be found not guilty, in my opinion. Because, it breaks me down to this. This is the closest you're going to get to me on the support side. This is the closest you're ever going to, so listen close. This is the closest you're ever going to get. To me, I've always said, if Darlie didn't do this, then Darin did. I've always said this. Because there was no intruder in that house. I think in the end, if the Innocence Project finds anything, they're going to find that it was Darin that did it. I believe Darlie did it. 100%. I believe that she was stressed out, the money wasn't there, and she wanted to get back at Darin. But it wouldn't surprise me too much if Darin felt like a way that he could get insurance money and make financial futures for him a little bit easier would be to eliminate 2 children. I'm not saying that, but I'm saying if Darlie didn't, I've said this before too, and I catch flack for it. If there's something that we're missing, if Darlie didn't do it, then Darin did, because there was no intruder in that house. Now let's think about it. I'm playing the devil's advocate here, all right? Darin could have went out there and cut that screen while he was fixing that gate. Darin could have brought that knife right back in there. Darin could have even slashed Darlie. But we honestly believe that she did that at the sink. But is it possible in the scenario? Could Darin have done it? Yes. Now I'm going to get some comments from my non-supporter friends under here. That's okay. But, you know, this is as close as you're going to get to me on the support side. If Darlie didn't do this, then Darin did. Because there was no freaking intruder in that house. Period. We often wonder, even the non-supporters, we wonder, was it Darin that ran that sock down the alley? And we've discussed this before. How much did he have to gain, you know, from this murder? Who stands the most to gain? But Darlie said Darin was not the man she saw. On October 21, 1995, attorney Douglas Mulder was substituted as counsel for Mr. Routier. 1 month earlier, on September 20th, 1996, Mr. Mulder had represented Darin Routier in a contempt of court hearing involving a possible violation of a court order restricting publicity. That's when they went on KRLD and they had a gag order on them, and they weren't supposed to talk about the particulars of the case. Well, they were found not guilty of that because they didn't really talk about the particulars of the case. Well, Darin was. He was found not guilty of it. I haven't looked into Darlie Key. I think they were both found not guilty of that, but they did talk about the case, but just not the particulars. I learned that Douglas Mulder was considering whether or not to accept employment as counsel for Darlie Routier several weeks before October 21, 1996. Upon learning this possible employment by Darlie Routier and Mr. Mulder's representation of Darin Routier, I became concerned that Mr. Mulder would be unable to represent both Darlie and Darin Routier without breaching his duty of loyalty to one or both clients. Now I'd have to go back and look at the Texas Court of Appeals exactly, but I think it was that Mulder didn't cross-examine Darin. Mulder didn't speak to Darin during this gag order thing. I think that's why it wasn't a conflict of interest. But I'll get into that in another video. I communicated my concern orally to Mr. Mulder several weeks before his employment on October 21, 1996. I explained to Mr. Mulder that Darin Routier was a viable suspect in the murder of Damon and that Darlie Routier had not waived any conflict of interest between herself and her husband. Mr. Mulder indicated that he did not believe that Darin was involved in Damon's death, despite the fact that Mr. Mulder had not, at that time, had an opportunity to review the results of the defense counsel's investigation. I reiterated my concern to Mr. Mulder in writing on October 24, 1996, after the motion of substitution of counsel had been granted. I explained to Mr. Mulder that I continued to believe that Darin Routier was a possible perpetrator of the offense, and that the court had not addressed the possible conflict of interest generated by my simultaneous representation of Darlie and Darin Routier. By Mulder's simultaneous. I sent the letter in part because Mr. Mulder had suggested in chambers of the trial court on October 21, 1996, that he was not yet fully familiar with all aspects of the case at the time. Now, this is a great hearing from the Texas Court of Criminal Appeals. They're the ones that have helped Melissa Lucio get her recommendation for actual innocence. You can see here the reason why there was no conflict of interest, and I wanted to go back through it, but it shows on September 19, 1996, the state filed a motion to discharge the appellant's appointed attorneys because Mulder had informed the trial court on September 12, 1996 that he had been retained to represent the appellant. The trial court held a hearing on September 20, 1996 on the allegations that Darlie Key, the appellant's mother, and Darin Routier, the appellant's husband, had violated a gag order imposed by the court by talking about the case on the radio. The gag order prohibited witnesses or prospective witnesses from talking about the expected testimony of the appellant or any witnesses, the character, the reputation, or credibility of any witnesses, the contents of any statement given by the appellant, and the nature of the evidence that might be presented. I heard bits and pieces of that, but I haven't heard the full interview. If anybody has the KRLD interview that they did with, what was his name, Robbie Robertson, if anybody has it or knows how to lead me to it, I'll put it up. At the beginning of the hearing, Mulder said, "I am retained by Miss Key to represent her, and she has asked me to represent Darin as well. I did not know that until this morning." Mulder did not introduce any evidence or call Darin as a witness. The trial court asked questions of Darin without placing him under oath. The trial court found that Darin had not violated the gag order because he did not discuss prohibited information. Just wanted to show that real quick. Now here's where we get to the interesting part on the same motion, the same writ, the same hearings. On November 12, 1996, the state filed a motion to determine whether Mulder had a conflict of interest regarding his representation of Darin Routier. The state's motion stated that Mulder knew, when he was substituted as counsel for the appellant, that the state disbelieved the appellant's claim that the murders were committed by an unknown intruder. Mulder also knew that Darin Routier was the only other adult in the house that night. The state was continuing its investigation. The state then explained that recent analysis of physical evidence suggested that Darin Routier may have participated with the appellant in the crime or the cover-up of the crime. The state knew it. The state felt it. It requested that the trial court hold a hearing to determine whether a conflict existed for Mulder. The appellant would waive any potential conflict, and Darin Routier would waive any potential conflict. The recent analysis of which the state spoke in its motion included a white tube sock found in the alley behind the Routier's home, in which was found the blood of both children, a faint trace of the appellant's DNA, and fibers from Darin's sneakers. Also, the knife that inflicted the children's appellant's wound was found to have a head hair that matched a known sample of Darin Routier's head hair. That head hair could easily be disputed because she did stick it on the counter. She did put the knife down on the counter, and as Darin's walking back and forth through the kitchen, you lose head hair. You lose it. So that could easily be disputed. On the day the state filed its motion, the trial court discussed having a hearing on the motion. The trial court stated that on the record that it believed that the appellant, Darin Routier, had already waived any potential conflict on the first day of the proceedings that were conducted in Kerrville, October 21, 1996. The appellant agreed with the trial court that both she and Darin waived any potential conflicts on that day. The appellant claims that Mulder's representation of Darin Routier while Darin was a suspect created a conflict of interest that foreclosed a strategy of shifting responsibility for the murders to Darin Routier. The appellant argues that this actual conflict requires reversal because the trial judge failed to have a hearing on the conflict. That's a whole nother story. The state claims that no conflict arose from Mulder's limited representation of Darin Routier for the purposes of the gag order. Moreover, 3 other attorneys represented the appellant during the trial. The record does not show actual conflict of interest, which the trial court should have been aware of. Okay, so I'm getting this from Plainview. This came out immediately after that affidavit that Darin claims that he signed to help Darlie. I'll do it to help Darlie. I did it for Darlie. So this article came out directly after that, and I want to go through it. We'll be looking at this together. I just want to go through it. Darlie Routier's husband discussed staging of a home burglary insurance scam to pay off debt several months before 2 of the couple's sons were stabbed to death in their living room, according to affidavits. Darin Routier recently admitted that he wanted to hire someone to break into their upscale Rowlett home in the spring of 1996 while the family was away. According to an account first reported on Texas Monthly's July issue. He said he discussed it with his wife's stepfather, Robbie Gene Key. Robbie Gene Key did have a conviction for grand theft. 1991 conviction of grand theft. It was a truck that was found on his property. He did have a conviction for that. And then, so, now we're going to talk about this. He said he discussed it with his wife's stepfather and possibly others, including some reputed car thieves. Okay? But never pursued the plan and didn't tell authorities even after his wife was arrested, convicted, and sent to death row. If Darin knew that these were reputed car thieves, right, he would have to know a little bit about their background, right? He would have to know, so it can't be just some random person that overheard Darin talking about this, right? The supporters will want you to believe that Darin was discussing this with, but Darin did know that his stepfather, Robbie Gene Key, was convicted of grand theft, and it was a car. Robbie Gene Key was also the president of the Texas Corvette Club for quite a while. There's pictures of Darlie Key and Robbie driving around, in nice new Corvettes. And he had, they're $50,000 a pop most of the time. And he had several of them. But they needed your money to help Darlie get out. They needed your money. I had it out with Robbie Key about that. He would be in the group. I think Pam spoke with him a couple times. And then there's Robbie Key Jr. But, if you could drive around in Corvettes and go in parades and be the Texas president and keep your hobby is collecting classic Corvettes, then you don't need to ask the public to help your daughter. Sorry. Sell a couple Corvettes. Okay, so back to this. We'll go down here a little bit. Dow's attorney, Stephen Cooper, said he will use the information which he learned about in 2000. Okay, he says he learned about it in the year 2000 when he files a writ of habeas corpus in July. He is seeking a new trial, claiming the new evidence proves Darlie Routier is innocent. Well, it doesn't prove that Darlie Routier is innocent. It proves that Darin said he asked multiple people. That's the only thing that it would prove to the courts, right? And remember this, too. I can't stress this enough. That family wants to accuse everybody else. Glenn Mize, Gary Austin, the guy at the pawn shop, random people, somebody that knew Darlie. They want to accuse everybody. But they don't go for these multiple people. This was a planned scheme, in my opinion, except, I have to weigh this up, except Basha told me, and the 200 and some thousand other people that watch them videos, that Darin and Darlie both wanted her to participate in a scam to rob the home. Darin and Darlie both. In that interview, Basha also explained to me about the car that they actually did have stolen. It was a Jaguar in '93. That they did have it stolen. If we can't find any information, we've looked for information on Darin's insurance claim on that car. But, you know, it all goes back to where Darlie said, well, I found out about things I didn't know about back then. So you have to weigh that up for yourself. But I think that this whole thing was just a scheme. And Rich was telling me and Rich are arguing under one of the videos. He's like, well, wouldn't that be perjury? Why wasn't Darin charged with perjury? At first, I didn't know if the affidavit was actually filed, and I did some research. Pam helped me out. It was filed. So I got to looking at the way, you know, I've always said the way that this is written, you know, I asked multiple people, and I mentioned to somebody that I wouldn't care if my car came up missing and he took the car. Darin never mentions any names. So how can you prove? I mean, you can't get him for perjury because you can't prove that he didn't actually have these conversations. Unless they really came down on him and said, okay, now you're going to name these people. Which they didn't do. You're going to name these people, you're going to come up with perjury. But you can watch Darin on The Last Defense. You know, he claims he only did that for Darlie. Period. At trial, stayed hammered home. Why Darlie? Why this house? This information certainly leads to a more distinct possibility of an intruder, Cooper said on Friday. I don't think so. Okay, because the way the crime went down. How are they supposed to haul that stuff away? Why would they choose 2:30 in the morning? How are they supposed to, what are you supposed to just, you know, a couple guys carrying out a leather couch, big screen TV, out the garage at 2:30 in the morning? Where were they carrying it to? The alley? Nobody saw a truck. And if you're going to be moving things out, heavy stuff out, wouldn't you bring your own gloves? And if it was a random person, just think about it like this. They hear Darin talking about it. And when we're gone, you know, I'm going to have somebody come in my house and steal. That whole thing is blown away as soon as they get to the house and see the TV on, or they get inside that screen and see that there was people there. You know, people would notice a big truck. And just think about it like this. Darin had some expensive things in his home, right? The leather couches, the television, you know, some of her jewelry was very expensive. But you would have to carry that out and put it in a truck to get anything out. You'd have to clean the whole house out, which would take a while. That neighborhood, they see things, right? They notice a black car, didn't they? So they say, Karen Neal, she was friends with Karen Neal. They noticed a black car. Why wouldn't they notice a U-Haul pulling up? Why wouldn't Karen Neal know, hey, they're gone for 2 weeks? You know, why is this U-Haul over at their house? It makes no sense to me. Makes no sense to me. The insurance scam is just a scam. And Darin was a suspect. He was a very well-known suspect. So the tunnel vision is gone. I think in the end, if the Innocence Project proves anything, they're going to prove that Darin did it. See, because they have to put a name on it. Darlie has to put a name on actual innocence. They have to put a name on it. Right? Because there was no intruder in that house. Period. There was no intruder. Would it surprise some of us non-supporters if it came to show that, hey, Darin actually did this? There's a bunch of us that wouldn't be surprised by it. We wouldn't be surprised. They haven't put out any evidence that shows that Darin did it. But if Darin came out one day and said, hey, I did it, he's not going to be able to say I had people come in and do it. Because there was no intruder in that house. There was none. That's where I stand on that. Now, the whole thing with perjury is the way that that affidavit was written. Let me show you. Like, I was kind of confused by this whole affidavit. I even messaged Pam because Pam has all these documents. She knows this case better than any of us do. And she loves to answer questions when we have them. So I asked her, I said, was that thing even filed in the courts? And if I would have just took my time and looked back and seen that it was filed right here. It was filed. District Court number 3. But if we notice, okay, so he was sworn by oath. I don't know who swore him by oath. Before me, the undersigned authority, on this day, personally appeared Darlie Routier, who, being by me duly sworn on his oath, stated the following. My name is Darlie Routier. I'm over the age of 21. I reside in McKinney, Texas. I am capable, fully competent to make this affidavit, blah, 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 yeah. In 1994, I spoke to a person, all right? How can the courts prove that he did not speak to a person, even though us out here, we don't believe that he did? But how can the courts prove that he didn't speak to a person? Factual evidence. How can they prove he didn't? Unless they pressured him to name that person. In 1994, I spoke to a person about my Jaguar automobile. In that conversation, I said it wouldn't bother me if that Jaguar was stolen. That person then stole the Jaguar. If they really wanted to push him for perjury, which Rich makes a good point, they didn't push him for perjury. I think it's because they knew that this was all a bunch of shit and they didn't want to waste the court's time. All they would have had to do was look for the police report on this. Now, he can name Robbie Jean Key, all right, but he can't name Joe Blow down the street. He can name Robbie Jean Key, and if they would have came to him and said, well, did he talk to you about an insurance scam? He can say, yeah, he did. And they can't prove that that never happened. That's why he wasn't charged with perjury. Darin gives us about as close as to what he's going to ever give us in the last defense. I think he agreed to that show because he said, I've never really defended myself until now, if you catch that. And he's defending himself by saying, I love Darlie, and that's why I made up this bullshit lie. If you read between the lines with him. But okay, so the consensus of this video is 1, Darin was a suspect. He was but the family said, we're not going to hire you. And when they found out that Doug Parks was going to name Darin, they didn't want no part of that shit either. One might think, why would they do that? Why would they do that? I think I know why. I think I know why Sirota always stood for Darlie too. Because of Drake. They didn't want him to suffer anymore. They want Drake to think that his mother is in there for something that she didn't do. They don't want him to think that his dad would be in there for something that he did do. That's why they don't touch it. That's why they don't touch it. Tell me what you think. Comment below. Be sure and hit that like button. If you like these videos, it'll get them out there where more people can see it. Give me your opinions. If supporter or non-supporter. I actually like it when the supporters come in and because I can learn from you. Just like I learned from Danelle. I'm not one, I don't have a problem with admitting that I can learn some stuff from this case. And in all honesty, I would really love it if you guys could prove it to me that Darlie did not do this to her children. I would love it. But I'm just a freaking hillbilly hick from Ohio, a convict myself. And I can see I can see this case. I'm not an expert in anything. I'm not a, quote, private investigator. And I'm not going to be at you with, well, Darlie Lynn told me. I'm a nobody. But if I can break it down like I have been in these videos and show you like I have been in these videos that she is guilty and deserves to be where she needs to be, then I can also be convinced rather easy. I don't want to do this just to be right. I don't want Darlie to be guilty. I don't want her to be guilty. I want it to be an intruder for the sake of her family and her kids, her child, Drake. I don't want her to be guilty. She just is. I'd love for them to prove to me that she's innocent. And I wouldn't take it as, oh, that's bullshit, blah, blah. And I wouldn't be embarrassed. I would feel glad for that family and all these people that care about Darlie and that support her with passion. That would be number one thing. Good. That mother didn't do this. But you have to prove it. And you can't prove it by saying, well, they told me, or these are in the works, or, she'll be out by Christmas. You can't prove it to me that way. And you can't prove it to me by having me catching her in lies. You cannot prove that to me. When I say justice for Devin and Damon, I don't necessarily mean put a needle in Darlie's arm. I mean prove it. If you think she's innocent, then prove it. Don't come up with speculation. Rich, you say that all the time. I don't want to speculate. And usually when you say I don't want to speculate, you begin to speculate. And Rich, do you want me to do a compilation through your videos where you're going, in my opinion, you say it a certain way with the O, my opinion. Or I don't want to speculate, then you go in and speculate. You want me to do a compilation of that? Or I can do a compilation of you going, well, Darlie said, or I spoke to Darlie Lynn. Rich, that doesn't mean anything. Justice for Devin and Damon Routier.